The massive space station slowly rotated against the backdrop of distant stars as Captain Jake Morrison watched from the observation deck. The Galactic Conservatory of Art stretched for miles in every direction, its gleaming corridors filled with beings from across the known galaxy. Jake had commanded this cultural hub for 3 years now, and still the sight of so many different species working together amazed him. Today was different, though. Today marked the beginning of the annual Interspecies Cultural Showcase, the most important artistic event in galactic history. Representatives from 12 different alien civilizations had gathered to share their greatest cultural achievements. For humanity, this showcase represented something crucial. Earth's standing among the galactic community had always been shaky at best. Other species saw humans as newcomers, primitives who had barely mastered space travel while ancient civilizations had been exploring the stars for millennia. Jake's communicator buzzed. "Captain Morrison, the Earth delegation has arrived at Docking Bay 7, came the voice of Lieutenant Amy Collins from the control room. Jake straightened his uniform and headed toward the docking area. This year's human representative was unusual, to say the least. Instead of sending their finest adult musicians or artists, Earth had chosen to send a 10-year-old boy named Ruihan Chen. The docking bay doors hissed open as Jake approached. A small transport ship bearing Earth's insignia had just landed. The first person to emerge was Ms. Linda Baker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. She taught music at a small school in Ohio and had discovered something special in young Ruihan. Behind her walked a man in his 30s, Uncle Tim Foster, who served as the boy's guardian. Then Ruihan himself stepped onto the station. He was small even for his age, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He carried a worn leather case that contained sheet music and clutched it protectively against his chest. Jake had read the boy's file. Ruihan had been playing piano since he was 4 years old. By age 7, he was performing pieces that professional musicians struggled with. By 9, he had mastered works that were considered nearly impossible. "Welcome to the Galactic Conservatory," Jake said, extending his hand to Ms. Baker. "I'm Captain Morrison. We're honored to have you here." Ms. Baker smiled nervously. "Thank you, Captain. I have to admit, this is all rather overwhelming. We've never seen anything like this place." Jake understood her feelings. The conservatory was unlike anything on Earth. Alien architecture blended seamlessly with human engineering. Crystalline structures that sang in the wind stood next to gardens where plants from a dozen worlds grew in harmony. The very air seemed to hum with creative energy from so many different cultures coming together. "What will Ruihan be performing?" Jake asked as they walked through the main corridor. Other delegates passed by them, some floating, others walking on multiple legs, a few that seemed to be made of pure energy. Ruihan watched them all with quiet curiosity, showing no fear despite being surrounded by beings that most humans had never even imagined. "Chopin's Etude Opus 25, number 11, Ms. Baker replied. "It's known as the Winter Wind." Jake knew little about classical music, but he had done some research after learning about their performance choice. The Winter Wind was considered one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. It required incredible speed, precision, and stamina. Most adult concert pianists found it challenging. For a 10-year-old to attempt, it seemed almost impossible. "The other delegates have been asking about our presentation," Jake said carefully. Some of them seemed curious about sending someone so young. Tim Foster spoke up for the first time. "Ruihan isn't just any 10-year-old. When he plays, something special happens. People stop what they're doing and listen. Even people who don't, like classical music, find themselves drawn to his performances." They entered the main performance hall, a vast circular space with perfect acoustics. At the center stood a simple black piano, looking small and primitive compared to the advanced instruments that other species had brought. The Zephyrians had constructed a crystalline array that could produce sounds beyond human hearing range. The Lumina had built light sculptures that created music through controlled photon emissions. The human piano seemed laughably basic in comparison. "The showcase begins tomorrow," Jake explained. "Each species will present their finest artistic achievement. The performances are being broadcast across the galaxy. Millions of beings will be watching. Ruihan finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "May I try the piano?" Jake nodded, and the boy walked to the instrument. He sat on the bench, his feet barely reaching the floor. He opened his music case and pulled out a well-worn score. The pages looked like they had been turned thousands of times. Ruihan placed his small hands on the keys and began to play a few scales, testing the instrument's response. Even these simple exercises caught the attention of nearby alien delegates. A group of klaxons, insectoid beings with natural rhythm abilities, paused their buzzing conversation to listen. Two ethereals, gaseous creatures that communicated through atmospheric vibrations, drifted closer to observe. "The instrument seems adequate," Ruihan said simply. He closed the piano and stood up. "I should practice more tonight." As they left the performance hall, Jake noticed that word was already spreading among the alien delegates. A 10-year-old human child was going to perform classical music on a primitive acoustic instrument. Some species found this amusing. Others seemed genuinely curious. A few appeared dismissive, as if humanity was not taking the showcase seriously. Dr. Peter Walsh, the human cultural attaché, joined them for dinner in the station's diplomatic quarter. He was a nervous man who understood the importance of this event perhaps better than anyone else. "The other delegates have been asking questions," he said over their meal. "Some wonder if we're making a statement by sending a child. Others think, we don't understand the significance of the showcase." "Let them wonder," Ms. Baker said firmly. "When Ruihan plays tomorrow, they'll understand." That evening, Jake found himself back at the observation deck, looking out at the stars. The fate of Earth's cultural reputation rested on the small shoulders of a 10-year-old boy. It seemed impossible, yet something about Ruihan suggested that impossible was exactly what he specialized in. Tomorrow would reveal whether humanity had made a brilliant choice or a terrible mistake. The morning of the showcase brought an air of tension throughout the Galactic Conservatory. Captain Jake Morrison walked through the corridors and could feel the anticipation building among the various alien delegations. Each species had spent months preparing their presentations, and today would determine which civilizations were considered the galaxy's true artistic masters. In the Zephyrian quarters, harmonist Veltar stood before his crystalline instrument array. His translucent body caught the light as he moved, creating rainbow patterns across the walls. Veltar had lived for over 3 centuries and had mastered every form of musical mathematics known to his species. He found the human choice of representative both puzzling and insulting. "A child," he said to his assistant, Resonator Kethal. "They send us a child with a primitive percussion instrument." "Perhaps they do not understand the significance of this gathering," Kethal replied, his voice creating harmonic overtones that made the air itself sing. "Their species has only been in space for a few decades. They may not comprehend what true art requires." Veltar had studied human music during his preparation for the showcase. He found it chaotic and emotionally driven, lacking the mathematical precision that defined proper artistic expression. Zephyrian music was based on perfect frequency relationships that could be calculated to infinite decimal places. Human compositions seemed to rely on something they called feeling, which Veltar considered a primitive way of creating sound. In another section of the station, the klaxon delegation prepared their rhythmic presentation. These insectoid beings moved as one organism, their hive mind allowing them to create complex polyrhythmic patterns that individual musicians could never achieve. Commander Bistklick, their leader, had observed the human boy during his brief piano test the previous day. The small human creates sound without consulting the collective, Bistklick buzzed to his swarm. "How can one mind produce meaningful rhythm without the guidance of many? It is like trying to dance with only one leg." The klaxons had been creating music for millions of years. Their ancestors had developed rhythm before most species had even evolved consciousness. To them, the idea that a single individual could create something meaningful seemed not just unlikely but fundamentally impossible. Dr. Peter Walsh spent the morning moving between delegations, trying to manage diplomatic relations while fielding increasingly pointed questions about humanity's choice of representative. The aquatic Tidalans floated in their portable ocean tanks, their bioluminescent displays creating underwater symphonies of light and sound. Their ambassador, Flomer, expressed confusion through rapid color changes across her translucent skin. "We do not understand the human selection process," Flomer said through her translation device. "Is this child your species' greatest musical achievement? Has your civilization produced nothing more advanced in all your years?" Dr. Walsh struggled to explain. "Ruihan is exceptionally talented. His abilities far exceed what we would normally expect from someone his age." "Age is irrelevant," interrupted Vaporling Drift Essence, a gaseous being who communicated through controlled atmospheric disturbances. "Art transcends physical form, but your representative uses a mechanical device that requires physical manipulation. How primitive." The Vaporlings created music by reshaping their gaseous bodies to control air pressure and temperature. They could produce sounds that ranged from barely audible whispers to thunderous roars, all without any external instruments. To them, humanity's reliance on constructed tools seemed like a significant limitation. Commander Lisa Brooks found herself dealing with the diplomatic fallout from these conversations. As the station's chief diplomatic officer, she had experience managing tensions between different species, but this situation was particularly challenging. The other delegations weren't hostile exactly, but their skepticism was obvious and growing. "They think we're not taking this seriously," she reported to Captain Morrison during their morning briefing. "Some species are suggesting that humanity doesn't belong in the showcase at all." Jake rubbed his temples. "What's Ruihan's state of mind?" "Calm, apparently. Ms. Baker says he's been practicing since dawn, but he doesn't seem nervous. If anything, he seems excited about the opportunity to perform." Meanwhile, in the human quarters, Ruihan sat at a practice keyboard that had been provided for him. His small fingers moved through the complex passages of the Winter Winditude with mechanical precision. Ms. Baker watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. She had seen him perform this piece dozens of times, but never under such pressure. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked during a break in his practice. "Good," Ruihan replied simply. "The aliens make interesting sounds. I listened to some of their practice sessions yesterday. They're very different from human music." "Does that worry you?" Ruihan considered the question seriously. "No. Different isn't bad. It's just different. When I play Chopin, I'm not trying to sound like them. I'm trying to sound like Chopin." Uncle Tim Foster had been quiet all morning but finally spoke up. "Some of the other delegates seem to think humans don't belong here." "That's okay," Ruihan said, returning to his practice. "Maybe they'll change their minds after they hear the winter wind." His confidence was remarkable for someone his age, but Ms. Baker wondered if he truly understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a piano recital at a local school. The entire galaxy would be watching, judging not just Ruihan's performance, but humanity's worthiness to be considered an artistic civilization. The Geometrid delegation had spent the morning analyzing human musical compositions using advanced mathematical models. These beings existed as pure geometric forms, experiencing reality through precise calculations and spatial relationships. They had reduced Chopin's entire catalog to numerical sequences, searching for patterns that might indicate genuine artistic merit. "The mathematical relationships are inconsistent," announced primary angle acute vertex to his colleagues. "The human composer appears to have created these sequences randomly, without proper geometric foundation. Perhaps their primitive minds cannot comprehend true mathematical beauty," suggested Triangle Base. "They create sound without understanding the underlying mathematical truths." As the day progressed, the skepticism among alien delegations grew stronger. None of them openly dismissed humanity's participation, but their private conversations revealed deep doubts about what a human child could possibly contribute to a gathering of the galaxy's most advanced artistic civilizations. The showcase would begin in just a few hours, and Ruihan Chen, 10 years old and barely 4 feet tall, carried the weight of humanity's cultural reputation on his small shoulders. Around him, beings with millions of years of evolutionary advantage prepared to demonstrate why their species deserve to be considered the galaxy's true artistic masters. Commander Lisa Brooks found Ruihan in the practice room 2 hours before the showcase was scheduled to begin. The 10-year-old sat at the piano bench, his legs swinging slightly because his feet couldn't quite reach the floor. His small hands moved through a particularly difficult passage of the winter wind etude, the notes cascading like actual wind through frozen trees. Despite the complexity of what he was playing, his expression remained calm and focused. "Ruihan," Lisa said softly, not wanting to startle him. "May I speak with you for a moment?" The boy finished the phrase he was working on and turned to face her. "Yes, ma'am." Lisa pulled up a chair beside the piano bench. She had been a military officer for 15 years and had briefed soldiers before dangerous missions. But somehow talking to this child felt more challenging than anything she had ever done. "Do you understand how important today's performance is?" "Ms. Baker explained it to me," Ruihan replied. "The aliens are going to decide if humans are good at making art. If I play well, they might think better of us." "That's right. But it's more complicated than that," Lisa continued carefully. "Earth's relationship with other worlds depends partly on how they see us culturally. Some species judge civilizations based on their artistic achievements. They believe that true intelligence can only be measured by the beauty a species creates." Ruihan nodded thoughtfully. "So if I mess up, it won't just be embarrassing for me. It will be bad for all humans." Lisa winced at his direct understanding of the situation. "I don't want you to feel that pressure. You're just a child, and this responsibility shouldn't be yours to carry." "But it is mine to carry," Ruihan said, matter-of-factly. "I'm the one who volunteered to come here. I'm the one who's going to play. Nobody forced me." The simple wisdom in his words caught Lisa off guard. She had expected to find a nervous child who needed reassurance. Instead, she found someone who understood the situation clearly and had accepted the responsibility willingly. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "A little," Ruihan admitted. "But I get nervous before every performance. Ms. Baker says that's normal. She says the nervousness goes away once I start playing." In another part of the station, Dr. Peter Walsh was having a much more anxious conversation with Captain Morrison. The cultural attaché had spent the morning monitoring communications between the various alien delegations, and the reports were not encouraging. "They're placing bets on how badly we'll embarrass ourselves," Dr. Walsh said, pacing back and forth in the captain's office. "The Lumina delegation actually laughed when they heard we were sending a child. The Ethereals think it's some kind of elaborate joke." Captain Morrison studied the latest diplomatic reports on his desk. "What about the species that are more sympathetic? To us?" "Even the friendly ones are confused," Dr. Walsh replied. "The Aquatic Coalition sent a message asking if we needed to postpone our presentation due to some kind of emergency. They assume something must have gone wrong with our original plans." "Maybe something did go wrong," Morrison muttered. "Maybe we should have sent the New York Philharmonic or the London Symphony Orchestra." "It's too late for second thoughts now," Dr. Walsh said. "Besides, Earth Command specifically chose Ruihan after reviewing hundreds of potential representatives. They must have had their reasons." Morrison pulled up Ruihan's file on his computer screen. The boy's musical achievements were impressive by any standard. He had won every major youth piano competition in North America. Professional musicians who had heard him play described his abilities as unprecedented. One reviewer had written that listening to Ruihan perform was like witnessing magic made manifest through music. "Look at this," Morrison said, pointing to a section of the file. "It says here that when Ruihan performed at Carnegie Hall last year, 3 people in the audience claimed they had religious experiences during his performance of a Rachmaninoff concerto." "Religious experiences?" Dr. Walsh stopped pacing. "They said the music made them feel connected to something larger than themselves. One woman said she finally understood why her grandmother had loved classical music so much, even though she had never appreciated it before." Meanwhile, Ms. Baker was having her own moment of doubt as she helped Ruihan prepare for the performance. She had been his teacher for 3 years and had watched him develop from a remarkably talented child into something approaching a musical phenomenon. But standing in the vast performance hall, surrounded by alien technologies that defied imagination, She wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. "Linda," Uncle Tim said, approaching her while Ruihan continued his practice. "Are we doing the right thing? This is a lot of pressure for a 10-year-old. Ms. Baker watched Ruihan's hands move across the keys. Even during a simple warm-up exercise, there was something magical about the way he played. The notes seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, creating harmonies that weren't written in the music, but somehow belonged there anyway. "I've been teaching music for 25 years, she said quietly. "I've worked with hundreds of students, some of them incredibly gifted. But Ruihan is different. When he plays, he doesn't just perform the music. He becomes the music." "What do you mean?" "Watch his face when he plays," Ms. Baker said. "He's not thinking about technique or finger positions or any of the mechanical aspects of piano performance. He's feeling every note as if he composed it himself. That's not something you can teach. It's something you're born with." Tim observed Ruihan more closely. The boy's eyes were closed as he worked through a particularly beautiful section of the etude. His entire body swayed slightly with the rhythm, and his facial expression reflected the emotional content of the music. During the gentle passages, he looked peaceful and content. When the music became stormy and dramatic, his brow furrowed with concentration and intensity. "The aliens don't understand human emotion," Ms. Baker continued. "They create art through mathematics and technology and biological capabilities that we can't match. But they've never experienced what happens when pure human feeling gets channeled into sound. They're about to discover something they didn't know existed." The performance hall began filling with alien delegates as the showcase's start time approached. Ruihan finished his practice session and closed the piano. He looked up at Ms. Baker with the same calm expression he had worn all day. "I'm ready," he said simply. Ms. Baker felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. In 30 minutes, this remarkable child would walk onto the galaxy's most important cultural stage and attempt to prove that humanity deserved respect among the stars. The weight of that responsibility would have crushed most adults, but Ruihan seemed to carry it as easily as he carried his sheet music. "Remember," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "you're not just playing for the aliens. You're playing for Chopin and for everyone who has ever loved this music. Play it the way it lives in your heart." Ruihan nodded and smiled. "I will." The pre-showcase cultural exchange began an hour before the main presentations. This tradition allowed different species to share smaller demonstrations of their artistic approaches, helping the audience understand what they would experience during the formal performances. For many alien delegates, this was their first real opportunity to examine human musical concepts up close. Harmonist Veltar approached the human delegation with several of his fellow Zephyrians. Their crystalline bodies chimed softly as they moved, creating gentle harmonic progressions with each step. Dr. Peter Walsh stepped forward to facilitate the introduction, though he felt decidedly nervous about the encounter. "We would like to understand your musical mathematics," Veltar announced, his voice creating overtones that made nearby surfaces resonate. "Our analysis of human compositions reveals significant mathematical inconsistencies. How do you achieve artistic merit without proper frequency calculations?" Ms. Baker looked confused. "I'm not sure what you mean by musical mathematics. When Ruihan plays, he's not calculating anything. He's expressing the emotions that Chopin built into the composition." "Emotions," Resonator Kethal interjected, his tone suggesting the concept was unfamiliar. "Please define this term in musical context." "Well," Ms. Baker began carefully, "emotions are feelings. When Chopin wrote The Winter Wind, he was trying to capture the feeling of being caught in a fierce snowstorm. The fast notes represent the wind, the gentle sections represent moments of calm, and the dramatic climaxes represent the storm's power. The Zephyrians exchanged harmonic consultations among themselves. Veltar finally responded, "We do not understand how subjective internal experiences can create objective artistic value. Music is mathematics made audible. Beauty exists in perfect mathematical relationships, not in the random firing of biological neural networks." Ruihan, who had been listening, quietly spoke up. "Can you show us your music?" Veltar seemed surprised by the direct question. He gestured to Kethel, who activated a small crystalline device. Immediately, the air filled with sounds unlike anything the humans had ever heard. Perfect mathematical progressions spiraled through frequency spectrums, both above and below human hearing range. The music was technically flawless, each note precisely calculated to create optimal harmonic relationships. "It's very precise," Ruihan said politely after the demonstration ended, "but it doesn't make me feel anything." Feel? Veltar's confusion was obvious. Art is not intended to create biological responses. Art is the expression of universal mathematical truths. "But why would you want to express something that doesn't make you feel anything?" Ruihan asked innocently. The question seemed to stump the Zephyrians completely. They began a rapid harmonic discussion among themselves, their crystalline bodies resonating with increasing frequency as they tried to process this concept. Meanwhile, the Klaxon delegation had surrounded Uncle Tim with their buzzing inquiries. Commander Bztklik's compound eyes studied the human intently, while his swarm created rhythmic patterns in the air around them. "Explain individual musical creation," Bztklik demanded. "How does one mind produce rhythm without collective guidance? The concept seems impossible." Tim struggled to answer. "Well, humans are individuals. We each have our own thoughts and feelings. When someone like Ruihan plays, he's sharing his personal interpretation of the music." "Personal interpretation," Bztklik repeated slowly. "You mean each human would perform the same composition differently?" "Exactly. That's what makes live performance so special. No two pianists play Chopin exactly the same way." The Klaxons erupted in agitated buzzing. Their hive mind found the concept of individual artistic interpretation not just strange but almost offensive. How could art be meaningful if it changed based on the random preferences of individual performers? "This creates chaos," Bztklik declared. "Art must be consistent to have value. Your species creates random variations instead of pursuing perfection." Across the room, the Geometrid delegation was conducting their own investigation. Primary Angle Acute Vertex had constructed a mathematical model of Chopin's winter winditude, reducing it to pure numerical relationships. The results troubled him deeply. "The mathematical foundation is fundamentally flawed," he announced to his geometric colleagues. "The composition contains emotional variations that cannot be calculated in advance. How can art exist without predictable mathematical structure?" Dr. Walsh attempted to explain. "Human music isn't based on mathematics. It's based on emotional expression. The composer writes down feelings and the performer tries to communicate those feelings to the audience." "Feelings," Triangle Base said dismissively. "Biological responses to chemical stimuli. How can such random processes create meaningful artistic patterns?" "Because the feelings aren't random," Dr. Walsh replied, though he was beginning to realize how difficult this concept was to communicate to beings who had never experienced emotion. Love, sadness, joy, fear. These are universal human experiences. When Chopin writes music about longing for his homeland, any human can understand and relate to that feeling. The geometrids processed this information through their mathematical frameworks, but it made no sense to them. Art, in their understanding, should be based on eternal geometric truths, not temporary biological responses. The most challenging cultural exchange occurred with the Mindweavers, a telepathic species that experienced reality through shared mental connections. Ambassador Mindtouch attempted to probe Ruihan's thoughts directly, seeking to understand human music through mental contact. "There is something here we cannot read," Mindtouch reported to his delegation, his mental tendrils recoiling from Ruihan's mind. "The small human's thoughts contain patterns we cannot interpret. His mental state while playing differs significantly from his resting consciousness." "What do you sense?" asked Secondary Mindreach. "When he thinks about the music, his neural patterns become more complex, more beautiful somehow. But the patterns are not logical. They seem to exist in harmony with something we cannot detect." This concerned the Mindweavers greatly. As telepaths, they were accustomed to understanding any conscious mind they encountered. The idea that human consciousness contained elements beyond their comprehension challenged their fundamental assumptions about intelligence and awareness. Captain Morrison observed these cultural exchanges with growing unease. Instead of building understanding between species, the conversation seemed to be highlighting just how different human artistic concepts were from everything else in the galaxy. The aliens weren't being deliberately dismissive, but they genuinely could not comprehend how emotion-based art could have value. "Maybe we should have prepared them better," he said to Commander Brooks during a brief break in the exchanges. "Prepared? Them for what?" Brooks replied. "How do you explain emotion to beings who have never experienced it? How do you describe the color blue to something that has never seen light?" As the cultural exchange period came to an end, it became clear that none of the alien species understood what they were about to witness. They had analyzed human music through their own frameworks: mathematics, collective consciousness, telepathic probing, geometric relationships, but had completely missed the essential element that made it meaningful. Ruihan seemed unconcerned by the aliens' confusion. When Ms. Baker asked if the cultural exchange had made him nervous, he simply shrugged. "They don't understand yet," he said, "but they will after I play the Winter Wind." His confidence remained unshaken, even though every alien delegation had essentially concluded that human music was primitive, chaotic, and based on meaningless biological responses. In 30 minutes, a 10-year-old boy would attempt to prove that an entire galaxy was wrong about the nature of art itself. The main performance hall of the Galactic Conservatory had been transformed into an amphitheater that could accommodate 12 different species simultaneously. Environmental controls created separate atmospheric zones for beings that breathed different gases, while gravity generators allowed floating species to maintain their preferred positions. The lighting system adjusted continuously to provide optimal viewing conditions for eyes that ranged from ultraviolet sensitive crystals to electromagnetic field detectors. Captain Morrison stood at the central podium as the showcase officially began. Before him spread an audience unlike anything in Earth's history, thousands of alien beings representing the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. The air hummed with translation devices, atmospheric processors, and the various life support systems needed to keep such diverse forms of consciousness alive in one space. "Welcome to the annual Interspecies Cultural Showcase," Morrison announced, his words being simultaneously translated into 47 different forms of communication. "Today we celebrate the artistic achievements that define our civilizations and bind us together across the vastness of space." The first performance came from the Lumina delegation. These beings of living light had constructed a massive three-dimensional display that filled the central performance area. As their presentation began, controlled photon streams created shapes and patterns that danced through the air. The light forms told a story that spanned millennia, depicting the birth and death of stars, the formation of planets, and the emergence of consciousness across the galaxy. The display was breathtaking in its complexity. Billions of individual light particles moved in perfect coordination, creating images that shifted and flowed like living paintings. The Lumina could manipulate electromagnetic radiation with their minds, and their art consisted of light symphonies that painted stories directly onto the viewer's vision. The audience responded with enthusiasm. The Zephyrians created harmonic overtones that resonated with the light frequencies. The ethereals shaped their gaseous forms to interact with the photon streams. Even the mathematical geometrids found beauty in the precise calculations required to coordinate so many light sources. The Lumina performance concluded to widespread appreciation, setting a high standard for the presentations that followed. As the light display faded, whispers and communications rippled through the alien audience. How could the other delegations match such technological and artistic sophistication? The resonance presented next, and their performance literally shook the station. These massive beings, each the size of a small building, used controlled seismic vibrations to create music that could be felt as much as heard. Their composition told the story of planetary formation, with deep bass notes representing the birth of worlds and higher frequencies depicting the development of life. The hall's structural systems had been specially reinforced for their performance, but even so, the walls vibrated in harmony with their subsonic symphonies. The audience felt the music in their bones, their shells, their crystalline matrices, or whatever structures made up their bodies. It was a physically overwhelming experience that demonstrated the resonance mastery over the fundamental forces of matter itself. When the Vaporlings took their turn, they transformed the performance area into a swirling atmospheric artwork. These gaseous beings could control temperature, pressure, and humidity with incredible precision. They created weather patterns in miniature, generating thunderstorms, tornadoes, and gentle breezes all within the confines of the hall. Their presentation depicted the evolution of atmosphere on living worlds. Clouds formed and dissipated in patterns that told stories of rain and drought, storm and calm. The Vaporlings themselves became part of the artwork, their bodies merging with and controlling the artificial weather systems they had created. The klaxons followed with a rhythmic performance that seemed to come from a single organism rather than multiple individuals. Thousands of insectoid beings moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies creating percussion through coordinated movements. The complexity of their polyrhythmic patterns was mathematically stunning, with dozens of different beats operating simultaneously while maintaining perfect timing. Their hive mind allowed them to perform rhythmic compositions that no individual musician could ever achieve. The sound filled the hall like a mechanical heartbeat from some vast, living machine. The precision was absolute, each beat timed to atomic scale accuracy. As performance followed performance, a clear pattern emerged. Each alien species had achieved artistic mastery through capabilities that humans simply did not possess. The Zephyrians created mathematical music through crystalline resonance. The Geometrids projected geometric patterns that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. The Tidalans generated bioluminescent displays that told stories through controlled evolution of light-producing organisms. Dr. Walsh watched the presentations with growing anxiety. How could a human child with an acoustic piano compete with such displays of technological and biological superiority? The aliens were using abilities that humanity had never developed and could barely comprehend. "They're all so advanced," he whispered to Commander Brooks during a brief intermission. "Each species has had millions of years to perfect their artistic forms. We've had a few thousand years at most." "Quality isn't always about time," Brooks replied, though she felt her own doubts growing. "Sometimes it's about the approach itself." In the human delegation area, Ruihan sat quietly with Ms. Baker, watching the alien performances with genuine interest. Uncle Tim had expected the boy to be intimidated by the technological marvels he was witnessing, but Ruihan seemed calm and focused. "They're all very impressive," Ruihan said during the intermission. "I've never seen anything like what they can do." "Does that make you nervous about your performance?" Ms. Baker asked. "No," Ruihan replied thoughtfully. "They're doing things I could never do, but I can do something they can't do either." "What's that?" "I can play Chopin." His simple confidence was remarkable given what they had just witnessed. The alien performances had demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost godlike in their scope and precision. Beings who could manipulate light, control weather, create mathematical music, and coordinate hive mind rhythms had just shown why their species were considered the galaxy's artistic masters. The second half of the showcase was about to begin, and the alien audience had been thoroughly impressed by the demonstrations of their peers. Technical sophistication had reached levels that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Artistic concepts had been explored through methods that transcended normal sensory experience. And now it was humanity's turn. The announcement came through the translation systems in all 47 languages simultaneously. Representing the species Homo sapiens from the planet Earth, 10-year-old Ruihan Chen will perform Chopin's Etude Opus 25 No. 11, known as The Winter Wind, on acoustic piano. A murmur of amusement rippled through the alien audience. After witnessing such displays of technological artistry, the idea of a small human child playing a mechanical instrument seemed almost quaint. Some species began making what their cultures considered polite but dismissive sounds, preparing to endure what they expected to be a primitive display. Ruihan stood up from his seat and walked toward the performance area. The massive hall, which had just contained weather systems, light sculptures, and seismic symphonies, now held only a simple black piano. The contrast was striking. Where alien technology had filled the space with wonders, Humanity offered only a child and an instrument that was essentially a wooden box with metal strings. As Ruihan approached the piano bench, the alien audience settled into expectant silence. They had been impressed by technological mastery and biological capabilities that humans could never match. Now they waited to see what this small representative of Earth could possibly offer in response. Ruihan walked across the vast performance area, his small figure dwarfed by the massive space that had just contained weather systems and light sculptures. The simple black piano waited at the center, looking primitive and almost forgotten after the technological marvels the audience had witnessed. He carried his worn sheet music, though he had memorized the Winter Winditude years ago. The pages were more of a comfort than a necessity. The alien audience watched with polite but dismissive attention. Conversations continued in various languages, through atmospheric vibrations, harmonic overtones, and electromagnetic pulses. Many delegates had already begun to discuss their return journeys, assuming the human presentation would be brief and unremarkable. Ruihan reached the piano bench and adjusted it slightly to accommodate his height. His feet still did not reach the pedals properly, but he had learned to work around such limitations. He placed his sheet music on the piano's music stand, more out of habit than need, and sat down. For a moment he simply placed his hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling the familiar texture of ivory beneath his fingertips. The hall gradually quieted as alien delegates realized the performance was about to begin. Some species dimmed their natural luminescence out of courtesy. Others reduced their atmospheric disturbances to minimize interference. The vast space, which had been filled with excited chatter about the previous performances, settled into expectant silence. Ruihan closed his eyes for a moment, as he always did before performing. Ms. Baker had taught him this technique to center himself and connect with the music. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed in his expression. The quiet, polite boy had been replaced by something more focused, more intense. He raised his hands above the keyboard. The first notes of Chopin's Winter Winditude rang out across the performance hall. From the very beginning, something extraordinary happened. The opening measures, which introduced the main theme before the storm begins, filled the space with a clarity and precision that made several alien delegates pause their conversations. The notes seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed, creating harmonies that were not written in the score but somehow belonged there. Ruihan's small hands moved across the keyboard with supernatural precision. The Winter Winditude is one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for piano. It requires speed, accuracy, and stamina that challenge even professional concert pianists. For a 10-year-old to attempt it seemed almost impossible. For him to execute it flawlessly seemed to defy the laws of possibility. But it was not just the technical execution that began to capture the alien audience's attention. Something else was happening. Something that none of their advanced civilizations had ever experienced before. The music was not just sound, it was emotion made audible. The gentle opening theme gave way to the first hints of the coming storm. Ruihan's right hand began the rapid passages that would define the piece, notes cascading like actual snowflakes caught in an increasingly fierce wind. His left hand provided the harmonic foundation, but it was his right hand that painted the picture of winter's fury. Harmonist Veltar was the first to notice something unusual. His crystalline body, which naturally resonated with mathematical frequencies, began to vibrate in harmony with the piano's strings. But these were not the calculated resonances he was accustomed to. These harmonics seemed to emerge from some deeper source, as if the music was tapping into fundamental frequencies that existed beyond mathematical calculation. "This is impossible," he whispered to resonator Kethal. "The harmonic relationships are not following mathematical principles, yet they are creating perfect resonance patterns." The music built in intensity, and Ruihan's hands moved faster across the keys. The rapid passages that gave the etude its name began to fill the hall with the actual sound of wind. Not the controlled atmospheric disturbances that the vaporlings created, but something more primal and real. It was as if an actual winter storm had somehow been captured and transformed into sound. Commander Butclick of the Klaxons found his hive mind struggling to process what he was hearing. His species created rhythm through collective consciousness, with thousands of individuals moving in perfect synchronization. But this single human child was creating rhythmic patterns that seemed to emerge from multiple sources simultaneously. How could one mind generate such complexity? The rhythm calculations are incorrect, he buzzed to his swarm. Yet the patterns are more sophisticated than our collective algorithms can produce. As the performance continued, more alien delegates began to experience something unprecedented. The geometrids, who understood art only through mathematical relationships, found themselves calculating harmonic progressions that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond their comprehension. The patterns were mathematically perfect, yet they had not been created through mathematical processes. Primary angle acute vertex watched his geometric calculations break down as he tried to analyze what he was hearing. The mathematical foundation should not work, he announced to his colleagues. Yet the artistic result is achieving geometric perfection through non-geometric means. The mind weavers, telepathic beings who could read any conscious mind, found themselves completely unable to understand how Ruihan was creating what they were hearing. Ambassador Mind Touch attempted to probe the boy's thoughts during the performance, but what he discovered disturbed him deeply. His consciousness during performance is unlike anything we have encountered, Mind Touch reported to his delegation. He is not thinking about technique or calculation. His mind has become completely merged with something we cannot detect or understand. The music reached its first major climax, and Ruihan's entire body swayed with the rhythm. His eyes remained open but seemed focused on something beyond the physical keyboard. His hands moved with impossible speed and precision, creating the sound of winter wind that was so realistic, several atmospheric processors in the hall began adjusting their environmental controls in response. But it was not just technical mastery that was captivating the alien audience. Something deeper was happening. The music was communicating concepts that none of their civilizations had ever experienced. Through pure sound, a human child was transmitting emotions that transcended species barriers. The ethereals, gaseous beings, who communicated through atmospheric pressure changes, found their forms shifting in response to the music's emotional content. During the gentle passages, they became more condensed and peaceful. When the music turned stormy and dramatic, they expanded and became more turbulent. They were not consciously controlling these changes, the music was somehow affecting them at a fundamental level. We are experiencing involuntary atmospheric responses, Drift Essence reported to his fellow ethereals. The human sound vibrations are creating emotional resonance in our gaseous matrices. The Tidalans, floating in their portable ocean tanks, watched in amazement as their bioluminescent displays began synchronizing with the music without any conscious control. Their light patterns, which normally required deliberate manipulation, were responding automatically to the emotional content of Ruihan's performance. Flomer's color changes accelerated as the music built toward another climax. Our bioluminescence is harmonizing with the human composition, she reported. We are not controlling this response. The music is creating automatic physiological reactions. As the winter winditude moved into its final section, Ruihan's performance reached levels that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of both performer and instrument. His small hands covered the entire keyboard with speed that blurred the distinction between individual notes. The sound filled the massive hall not just with volume but with presence. It was as if the winter storm itself had materialized in the performance space. The alien audience, which had begun the presentation with polite skepticism, now sat in absolute silence. They were witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of what art could be. Through emotion translated into sound, a human child was creating experiences that their advanced civilizations, despite millions of years of development, had never imagined possible. And the performance was not yet finished. As Ruihan entered the final section of the winter winditude, something unprecedented began happening throughout the Galactic Conservatory's performance hall. The music had transcended its role as mere entertainment and had become something that seemed to interact with the station's very environment. The advanced systems that maintained life support for dozens of different species began responding to the emotional content of the performance in ways their designers had never intended. The atmospheric processors, designed to maintain precise environmental conditions for each alien delegation, started creating subtle variations that enhanced rather than disrupted the musical experience. When Ruihan played the gentler passages, the air circulation systems naturally slowed, creating a sense of stillness that complemented the peaceful sections of the composition. During the stormy climaxes, the ventilation increased, adding a barely perceptible movement of air that made the musical wind feel almost tangible. Captain Morrison watched from the control booth as his engineering staff reported impossible readings from throughout the station. "Sir, the environmental systems are operating outside normal parameters, but somehow everything is more stable than usual," reported Chief Engineer Paul Grant. "It's like the entire station is breathing in rhythm with the music." The lighting systems began their own spontaneous dance. The hall's illumination, designed to remain constant for optimal viewing conditions, started creating subtle variations that followed the emotional arc of the performance. During Ruihan's interpretation of winter's gentle moments, the lights became warmer and softer. When the musical storm reached its peak intensity, the lighting grew cooler and more dramatic, painting the performance space in shades that made the music visible as well as audible. Even the artificial gravity generators seemed affected. The slight variations in gravitational field strength were barely perceptible to most species, but they created a sensation of floating during the music's most ethereal passages, and a sense of groundedness during its more powerful moments. The technology was responding to something in the music that its creators had never programmed it to recognize. But the most remarkable changes were occurring in the alien audience members themselves. Species that had evolved on different worlds under alien stars were finding themselves united in an experience that transcended biological boundaries. The music was speaking to something deeper than species-specific neural patterns or sensory capabilities. It was communicating directly with consciousness itself. Harmonist Veltar felt his crystalline structure resonating in ways he had never experienced. For 3 centuries he had created music through precise mathematical calculations, believing that perfect frequency relationships were the highest form of artistic expression. But Ruihan's performance was teaching him that there were dimensions of musical beauty that existed beyond calculation. "This is impossible according to our harmonic theories," he whispered to Kethal. "Yet it is more beautiful than anything our mathematics have ever produced." His fellow Zephyrians were experiencing similar revelations. Their bodies, which had always generated music through conscious control of crystalline resonance, were now creating harmonies automatically in response to the human child's playing. They were not directing these sounds, they were being played like instruments by the music itself. The Klaxon delegation faced an even more profound challenge to their understanding. Commander Bizit-Click's hive mind, which had always operated as a unified consciousness, began experiencing something unprecedented: individual responses to the music. Different members of his swarm were having slightly different emotional reactions to the same passages, creating a diversity of experience that their collective intelligence had never encountered. The music is creating individual consciousness within the collective, Bizit-Click reported with amazement. Each unit is experiencing unique responses while maintaining connection to the whole. This was revolutionary for a species that had always believed consciousness could only exist through collective unity. Ruihan's performance was demonstrating that individual experience and collective harmony could coexist, that diversity of response could enhance rather than diminish artistic beauty. The geometrids found their mathematical worldview being gently shattered and rebuilt. Primary angle acute vertex had spent his existence believing that beauty could only emerge from perfect geometric relationships. But the winter winditude was creating aesthetic experiences that existed beyond geometric principles while somehow achieving geometric perfection through non-geometric means. "The patterns are mathematically impossible," he announced to his colleagues. "Yet they are creating mathematical beauty more pure than our calculations have ever achieved." The music was teaching them that truth could emerge from sources other than calculation, that beauty could exist in forms their logic had never imagined. They were witnessing art that transcended their understanding while simultaneously fulfilling their deepest mathematical desires. Perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring among the Mindweavers. These telepathic beings had always believed that consciousness was transparent to their mental probing, that any mind could be understood through direct contact. But Ruihan's consciousness during performance remained completely opaque to their abilities, not because it was shielded, but because it existed in a state they had never encountered. Ambassador Mind Touch attempted one final probe of the boys' mental state and found himself experiencing something unprecedented, a human emotion. For a brief moment, he felt what Ruihan was feeling as he played the music's most beautiful passage. The sensation was unlike anything in Mindweaver experience, overwhelming, joyful, and somehow connected to something larger than individual consciousness. The human child's mind during performance exists in a state of unity we cannot comprehend, Mind Touch reported to his delegation. He has achieved a form of consciousness that transcends individual awareness while maintaining individual identity. As the Winter Wind Etude approached its conclusion, the entire performance hall had become a unified organism responding to the music. Alien technologies were harmonizing with human emotion. Species that had never understood each other were sharing a common aesthetic experience. The barriers between different forms of consciousness were dissolving in the face of pure artistic beauty. Ruihan himself seemed transformed by the performance. The quiet, polite boy who had walked onto the stage had become a conduit for something larger than himself. His small hands continued to move across the keyboard with impossible precision, but his expression suggested that he was no longer directing the music so much as allowing it to flow through him. Ms. Baker watched from the human delegation area with tears in her eyes. In 25 years of teaching music, she had never witnessed anything approaching what was happening in this hall. Her student was not just performing Chopin's composition, he was creating a bridge between human consciousness and alien awareness, proving that beauty was a universal language that could unite any form of intelligent life. The final measures of the Winter Wind Etude began, and the entire hall held its breath in anticipation. Alien species that had existed for millions of years were about to discover what it meant to experience silence after hearing music that spoke directly to the soul. The final notes of Chopin's Winter Wind Etude hung in the vast performance hall like crystallized starlight. Ruihan's hands remained poised above the keyboard for several seconds after the music ended, as if he was reluctant to break the connection between himself and the composition. Slowly, he lowered his hands to his lap and sat quietly on the piano bench, his small form still radiating the intensity that had filled the last 20 minutes of performance. The silence that followed was unlike anything the Galactic Conservatory had ever experienced. It was not the mere absence of sound, but something deeper and more profound. The alien audience sat in absolute stillness, each species processing what they had just witnessed through their own unique forms of consciousness. The silence stretched on, becoming almost tangible as thousands of beings tried to comprehend an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of what art could be. Finally, harmonist Veltar rose from his position among the Zephyrian delegation. His crystalline body began to resonate, but instead of the calculated mathematical harmonies his species typically produced, the sounds emerging from his structure were entirely new. They were harmonic overtones of approval, frequencies that his kind had never created before because they had never experienced anything worthy of such response. The sound of Veltar's unprecedented harmonic approval triggered reactions throughout the alien audience. The ethereals began creating atmospheric displays that painted the air with shifting patterns of beauty. Their gaseous forms danced in configurations that expressed wonder and respect, concepts they had never before found worthy of such elaborate communication. The klaxons joined the response with rhythmic patterns that differed remarkably from their usual hive-mind precision. For the first time in their species' history, individual members of the swarm were creating slightly different beats, producing a complex polyrhythm that celebrated diversity within unity. Commander Bizdeklik himself seemed amazed by his delegation's response. "We are creating individual expressions within collective harmony," he announced. "The human child has taught us that unity and diversity can coexist in perfect rhythm." The geometrids began projecting mathematical visualizations that attempted to capture the impossible beauty they had experienced. Primary angle acute vertex. created geometric patterns that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond normal space, his forms reaching toward mathematical concepts that pure calculation had never revealed. "We have discovered mathematics that transcend geometry," he declared. "The human composition has shown us mathematical relationships that exist beyond our logical frameworks." But perhaps the most remarkable response came from the Lumina delegation. These beings of pure light had always considered their photon sculptures to be the highest form of artistic expression. Now they began creating light displays specifically designed to honor what they had just witnessed. Instead of complex technological demonstrations, they produced simple, beautiful patterns that seemed to glow with the same emotional warmth that had filled Ruihan's performance. The mind weavers, who had never encountered a consciousness they could not understand, approached Ruihan with something approaching reverence. Ambassador Mind Touch extended his mental tendrils toward the boy, not to probe or analyze, but to offer a telepathic gesture of respect. "Your consciousness during performance exists in a state we cannot comprehend, but deeply admire." Mind Touch communicated. "You have achieved unity between individual awareness and universal beauty." Ruihan, who had remained quietly seated at the piano during the alien responses, finally stood and faced the audience. He seemed slightly surprised by the intensity of their reaction, but not overwhelmed. He offered a simple bow, the same gesture he would have made after any piano recital. "Thank you," he said simply. "I hope you enjoyed Chopin's music." His humble response only intensified the alien appreciation. Here was a being who had just demonstrated capabilities that challenged the artistic foundations of entire civilizations, yet he spoke with the same quiet politeness he had shown throughout his visit to the station. Captain Morrison approached the performance area as the formal showcase concluded. The diplomatic implications of what had just occurred were staggering. In the space of 20 minutes, a 10-year-old human child had transformed Earth's standing among galactic civilizations. The species that had been considered primitive newcomers were now being recognized as possessors of something unique and valuable. Dr. Peter Walsh found himself surrounded by alien delegates asking urgent questions about human cultural capabilities. The Tidalans wanted to establish immediate cultural exchange programs. The Vaporlings requested permission to study human emotional expression. Even the proud Lumina offered to share their most advanced artistic technologies in exchange for opportunities to learn about human music. "We have underestimated your species' artistic potential," Flomer of the Tidalans admitted, her bioluminescent patterns creating apologetic color combinations. "We believed technological advancement was the only measure of cultural sophistication. Your child has shown us capabilities we never imagined possible." Ms. Baker approached Ruihan as the alien delegations continued their excited discussions. Her student sat quietly at the piano, running his fingers silently over the keys as if saying goodbye to the instrument that had served him so well. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Good," Ruihan replied with his characteristic simplicity. The aliens seemed to like the music. I think Chopin would have been pleased. His focus remained on the music itself, rather than the diplomatic triumph he had achieved. For him, the performance had been about sharing something beautiful, not about proving humanity's worth among the stars. Uncle Tim joined them, his expression mixing pride with amazement. "Do you understand what just happened? You've changed how the entire galaxy sees humanity." Ruihan considered this seriously. "I just played piano," he said finally. "The music did everything else." Commander Brooks approached the human delegation, with reports from throughout the station. "We're receiving communication requests from every major galactic civilization," she announced. "Earth is being invited to cultural exchanges, artistic collaborations, and educational programs. Some species are requesting permission to establish music schools on Earth." The winter winditude had accomplished what decades of diplomacy could not. It had proven that humanity possessed something unique and valuable, something that even the most advanced alien civilizations could not replicate or fully understand. The galaxy's species were discovering that intelligence and consciousness could take forms they had never imagined. As the formal ceremonies concluded and delegates began preparing for their return journeys, Harmonist Veltar approached Ruihan one final time. The ancient Zephyrian had lived for 3 centuries and had encountered artistic expressions from across the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for what he had experienced during the human performance. Your species possesses a form of consciousness that creates beauty beyond our understanding, Veltar said, his words creating harmonic overtones of deep respect. We would be honored to learn from your kind. You could visit Earth, Ruihan suggested. Ms. Baker knows lots of other musicians who play different kinds of music. I think you'd like Bach too. The innocence of his response charmed the ancient being. Here was a child who had just redefined galactic culture, casually inviting one of the galaxy's most sophisticated species to come hear more music. Months later, as reports of the showcase spread throughout civilized space, the Winter Wind Etude became the first human composition added to the galactic archive of significant art. Ruihan's performance was preserved and studied by alien musicologists, who found new layers of meaning with each analysis. But perhaps the most important change was in how the galaxy viewed consciousness itself. The alien species had learned that intelligence could take forms they had never imagined, that beauty could emerge from sources they had never considered, and that a 10-year-old human child with a piano could teach ancient civilizations new truths about the nature of art and awareness. Earth's cultural standing was transformed overnight, but more importantly, the galaxy had discovered that consciousness and creativity were far more diverse and wonderful than anyone had previously understood. Through the winter wind, humanity had shown the stars that sometimes the most profound truths come not from advanced technology or ancient wisdom, but from the simple act of one conscious being sharing beauty with another.